All right, ready to dive into something really relevant if you're prepping for the UPSC.
Let's do it.
Today, it's all about domestic workers in India, a topic that you'll find threads of in social, economic, even legal issues.
Absolutely. And, it's something that comes up in both the mains and the prelims.
Exactly. So we're going beyond just the facts here.
Yeah, we're going to be going beyond the what, getting into the why, thanks to a super insightful article we found on TH.
That's what these deep dives are all about.
It's going to give you a solid understanding whether your goal is to ace those exams or just be a well-informed citizen, which is always a good thing, right?
Always. But let's start with, a definition. Who are we actually talking about when we say domestic workers?
Well, the International Labor Organization, the ILO, they define domestic workers as anyone who is doing work in or for a private household.
Okay, so that covers a lot of different jobs.
It does, yeah. It could be caregiving, cleaning, cooking, anything that keeps a household up and running.
And we're talking about pretty massive workforce, right?
Huge, yeah. The article cites a government estimate from 2019, a staggering 39 lakh domestic workers in India.
Wow, 39 lakhs.
And get this, the majority, 26 lakhs of them, are women.
So we're talking mostly about women, and mostly from marginalized communities, right?
Exactly. And that brings us to a point that's especially important for those tackling the mains exam, the invisibility of this workforce.
Invisibility.
Yeah, think about it, the kind of work they do. Often informal arrangements, migrating from one state to another, trying to find work in the big cities.
Yeah, you don't really think about all that.
And it makes them super vulnerable. They don't have those protections most of us just take for granted.
It's true, and that's something that really hit home when I was reading the article, just how vulnerable they are, how they face low wages, abuse, even situations described as modern slavery.
It's pretty sobering, and the pandemic only made those problems worse.
Right. Imagine having to work in someone's home without proper safety measures during a global health crisis.
And that's just one layer of this issue. There's the legal aspect, too.
Yeah, what about legal protections? It seems like a complicated area. Does India even have specific laws for domestic workers?
That's a great question, and honestly, that's a big part of the problem.
Oh,
There isn't a dedicated central law in India specifically for domestic workers, just bits and pieces scattered throughout different laws.
no central law at all.
Yeah.
That's surprising.
There have been attempts to pass one, but so far, nothing concrete.
So what about the Unorganized Sector Social Security Act of 2008? Didn't that offer some protections?
It did, but it was replaced by the Code on Social Security in 2020, which hasn't been implemented.
Ah, so still no real protection.
Well, the Minimum Wages Act of 1948 technically includes domestic work, but only about 10 states have actually bothered to set minimum wages for the sector.
10 states, that's barely anything.
It is, and what about protection against things like sexual harassment?
Right, are they covered by the 2013 Act?
They are, but there isn't a strong way to enforce that act when it comes to work being done in private homes.
I see, so another gap in protection?
And then there's the Child Labor Act. It bans employing children under 14 for domestic work,
Okay, that makes sense.
but it allows it for kids over 14, saying that homes are a safe environment, which,
Is highly debatable, especially given how many kids are working in this sector.
absolutely. The article mentions something like 12.6 million minors working as domestic workers in India,
That's a huge number, 12.6 million.
and about 86% of them are girls, with a quarter being under 14, even though that's illegal.
It raises so many questions about why those girls are the ones in that position.
For sure, it's a whole other conversation we could have, but the need for stronger protections is clear.
Absolutely. But are there any bright spots, anything positive happening?
Actually, yes. Some states are taking the lead. Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Kerala, they've implemented their own laws.
Oh, that's great.
And they've set up bodies to oversee things like Social Security benefits, maternity care, minimum wages. They're setting a good example.
That's encouraging to hear.
And on a global level, it's worth noting that India supported the ILO Convention 189 back in 2011.
Right, that's the one that aims to improve conditions for domestic workers all over the world.
That's the one. It recognizes domestic work as actual work and pushes for those workers to have the same rights as anyone else.
But we haven't actually ratified it.
Right.
What's holding us back?
It's a tricky question, but we voted for it but haven't ratified it. That says a lot in itself.
It really does. So where do we go from here? What concrete steps can we take to tackle these issues?
Well, there are some key areas we need to focus on, like actually implementing the policies we already have, the draft National Domestic Worker Policy from 2019. That's a good place to start.
That sounds promising,
Uh,
but it's 2025. Why hasn't it been implemented?
That's a whole other conversation, but the takeaway is that just having policies isn't enough. You got to put them into action.
You're right. Actions speak louder than words, or policies in this case.
Exactly. We also need to strengthen the legal framework we have. Ratifying the ILO Convention 189 is huge, and having laws that really protect the rights of domestic workers, that would be a major step forward.
I can imagine. What would a law like that actually look like?
That's a fantastic question, one that deserves a deep dive all on its own, maybe for another episode.
Okay, noted. But legislation is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Right. We can't forget about empowering these workers themselves, make them aware of their rights, give them access to legal aid, support
It's
services.
about giving them the tools to advocate for themselves.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because now we need to look at the role of the judiciary, how the courts are addressing this issue or not.
So the judiciary, the courts, have they actually done anything to protect domestic workers?
They have, yeah, especially the Supreme Court. They've been pretty vocal about the need for stronger legal protections.
Can you give me some specific examples? Like, what has the Supreme Court actually done?
Well, the article mentions a recent directive from the Supreme Court to the central government. They want them to form an interministerial expert committee.
Interesting. What's this committee supposed to do?
Basically, their job is to figure out if we need a dedicated law to protect domestic workers, and that's a big deal.
It sounds like it, yeah. It means they're taking it seriously.
Exactly, and a law like that could really address a lot of the issues we've been talking about, setting clear guidelines for wages, working hours, safety.
It could even provide a way for workers to actually file complaints and get their problems resolved, right? And what about things like Social Security benefits? Would a law like that cover those?
It definitely could. It could be a real game changer for these workers.
But a law is only as good as its implementation, right?
You can have the best law in the world, but if nobody follows it, it's useless.
So it's not just about passing laws, it's about making sure they're actually enforced.
And that's where advocacy groups, NGOs, even just regular people come in. They need to hold the government accountable, make sure things actually change. It's a team effort.
100%. And as we dig deeper into this, we have to talk about the different types of exploitation domestic workers face.
The article goes into some pretty disturbing stuff.
It does. And low wages are just the tip of the iceberg.
It's crazy how many domestic workers are paid way below the minimum wage, working tons of hours with no breaks, no overtime pay.
It's straight up exploitation. And the fact that most of their work is informal, no written contracts or anything, makes it even worse.
It gives them zero power to negotiate or fight back.
And it makes it really hard to prove anything if something goes wrong.
It's kind of shocking that this is so common, that people can get away with this kind of stuff.
It shows you the power dynamics at play. Domestic workers are isolated in private homes, which makes them more likely to be abused and less likely to report it.
It's like they're trapped.
In a way, yeah, and the article talks about more than just low wages. It talks about physical abuse, emotional abuse, even sexual harassment.
It's terrifying how vulnerable they are. Their isolation, the fact that they depend on their employers for their livelihood, it makes them easy targets.
It's awful. And then you have cases of forced labor, human trafficking,
Right.
especially with kids from marginalized communities. The article mentions that too.
The ILO calls domestic work a form of modern slavery, and honestly, it's hard to disagree when you see what's happening.
It makes you realize this isn't just some abstract problem. It's real people's lives.
And it's happening all around us, but why? What are the factors that lead to this?
Well, I think part of it is just how much Indian households rely on domestic workers. It's almost seen as a necessity.
That's true, and that high demand, combined with the fact that it's all so informal and unregulated, creates the perfect conditions for exploitation.
Because employers know they can get away with it.
Exactly, they can dictate the terms, and the workers' well-being is often an afterthought.
And we can't forget about migration, how so many workers leave their homes in rural areas to find work in the cities.
That makes them even more vulnerable. They're away from their support systems, desperate for work, more likely to accept any conditions.
And then there were the placement agencies. The article says they play a role in exploiting workers too.
Oh yeah, they charge these crazy fees, and they don't even guarantee fair wages or safe working conditions.
It's like exploitation at every level.
And we haven't even touched on the social stigma. Domestic work is seen as low-level work, which just makes it easier for employers to treat workers poorly.
It's like we've normalized this whole system of exploitation, even though their work is so essential.
It's true, their work is essential, but it's invisible, undervalued.
It's almost like we don't even see them as real people.
And that's something that has to change. Our whole perception of domestic work needs to change.
We've talked a lot about the problems, but what about solutions? What can we actually do to make things better?
Well, for starters, we need to fix the legal stuff. Ratifying that ILO Convention 189 is a huge step in the right direction.
But we supported it back in 2011. Why haven't we ratified it yet? What's the holdup?
It's complicated, there's economics, politics, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it comes down to whether our leaders actually care enough to do something.
So we need people to speak up, put pressure on the government.
Absolutely. And beyond that, we have to empower the workers themselves. Let them know what their rights are, give them access to legal help if they need it.
So they can fight back if they need to.
Right. Knowledge is power, and they need to know they have options.
And we can't forget about the employers. We need them to step up too.
Yeah, they have to start treating their workers fairly, paying them properly, giving them decent working conditions, showing them basic respect. It shouldn't even be a question.
It's about creating a culture of respect, recognizing the value of their work.
Exactly. And we also need to address the root causes of why these workers are so vulnerable in the first place. Things like poverty, lack of education.
So investing in social programs, giving people more opportunities, that could help.
It could make a huge difference. It's about giving people choices so they don't have to rely on exploitative jobs just to survive.
So it's not a quick fix. It's a whole system that needs to change.
It's complex, yeah. And the article highlights another interesting piece of legislation, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023.
What's that?
It includes some pretty serious punishments for human trafficking, up to life in prison.
Wow, life in prison.
It's a big deal, and think about it. Domestic workers, especially those who migrate, they're prime targets for trafficking.
Because they're often desperate, they're away from home, easy to take advantage of.
Exactly, and the lack of regulation in the placement industry makes it even easier for traffickers to operate.
So having tougher laws against trafficking could actually help protect these workers.
It's about sending a message, making it clear that this kind of exploitation won't be tolerated.
And it could help prevent it from happening in the first place.
Prevention is key, and that's where empowering workers comes in again. If they know their rights, if they know what to look out for, they're less likely to fall victim to traffickers.
So it's about strong laws, enforcing those laws, and giving workers the knowledge and tools to protect themselves.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach, but it all comes back to awareness.
We can't just rely on the legal system. We need to change how society views this whole issue.
We need to start valuing domestic work, recognizing that it's real work, important work, and the people who do it deserve to be treated with dignity.
It's about respect, fairness, making sure their voices are heard.
And that's where organizations working on labor rights, women's empowerment, anti-trafficking, they play a huge role.
They're the ones on the front lines, fighting for the workers who can't always fight for themselves.
They're the ones pushing for change, making sure things actually happen, not just on paper, but in real life.
And we all have a role to play. We can all choose to treat domestic workers with respect, pay them fairly, speak up if we see something wrong.
It's about creating a culture of empathy, where everyone is accountable, where everyone's rights are respected.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I'm starting to see just how complex this whole issue is.
It is, and before we move on to potential solutions, I have to ask, what about the role of technology? Could technology help solve some of these problems domestic workers face?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that. How could technology actually help?
Well, technology can empower workers, and it can make things more transparent, which is a big problem in this sector.
Okay, I can
Yeah.
see that, but how? What would that look like?
Think about it. What if there was a platform, like an app or a website, that connected domestic workers directly with people looking to hire them?
So they could cut out the placement agencies.
Exactly. And it could even have a secure way to handle payments so the workers know they're getting paid fairly and on time.
That's a great idea, so they wouldn't have to worry about getting cheated out of their wages.
Right. And it could even let workers rate employers, kind of like those review sites.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome. It would hold employers accountable.
And help other workers know who to avoid.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And what about education? Could technology help with that?
Absolutely. You could have online platforms with modules about workers' rights, safety procedures, even financial literacy.
It would give them the knowledge they need to protect themselves.
And to manage their money better, it could be a game changer.
So technology could really disrupt the whole industry in a good way.
It has the potential, but we have to be careful about the digital divide. Not all workers have smartphones or computers or even know how to use them.
That's a good point. We don't want to create a system that leaves some people even further behind.
Exactly. We need to make sure everyone can benefit, but technology is definitely something to keep an eye on. And speaking of solutions,
Yeah. What else can we do?
the source mentions something called the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023. It's a new law that includes some really tough punishments for human trafficking.
Like how tough?
We're talking life imprisonment in some cases.
Wow, that's serious.
It shows they're starting to take trafficking seriously, which is a huge step.
But how does that relate to domestic workers specifically?
Think about how vulnerable they are, especially those who migrate. They're often lured with promises of good jobs, but it ends up being a trafficking situation.
That's awful. It's like modern day slavery.
It is. And with the placement industry being so unregulated, it's easy for traffickers to prey on these workers.
So cracking down on traffickers, making sure those agencies are held accountable, that would make a big difference.
It would, and it's not just about punishing them after the fact, it's about stopping it from happening in the first place.
Prevention is always better than a cure.
Right, and when workers know their rights, they're less likely to become victims. It all ties together.
So strong laws, enforcement, and empowered workers, it all goes hand in hand.
Exactly. And we can't forget about awareness. People need to know this is happening. They need to care.
It's about recognizing that these workers are human beings. They deserve respect. They deserve to be treated fairly.
And their work is valuable. It's essential. We can't just pretend they're invisible.
It's about seeing them, valuing them, listening to them.
And that's where civil society comes in. All those organizations fighting for workers' rights, they're the ones who are really making a difference.
And the ones who are out there advocating for change, supporting the workers, holding the government accountable.
They're the ones making sure these policies actually turn into real improvements in people's lives.
And we can all do our part too, even if it's just treating our own domestic workers with respect, paying them a fair wage, speaking up if we see something wrong.
It all adds up. It all contributes to creating a culture of empathy, of accountability, where everyone's rights are protected.
This has been a really insightful conversation. It's made me think about this issue in a whole new way.
Me too. And for all those UPSC aspirants out there, remember, understanding this topic isn't just about passing an exam. It's about equipping yourselves to make a real difference.
It's about being informed citizens, about understanding the challenges we face as a society, and being part of the solution.
And don't forget to check out the full article on TH. It's got a lot more detail, stats, and information that you'll find useful.
It's a great resource, definitely worth a read. So we've covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully it sparked some ideas, some questions, some inspiration.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive helpful, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel.
And share it with anyone who might be interested in this topic. The more people who know about this, the better.
And to all our listeners, keep those brains working, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.